Hi, everyone, and welcome to the MrpTech Podcast. This is episode 69. My name is Matt, and this is the weekly podcast discussing everyday tech for everyday people. Thanks so much again for joining us this week. I've got another great show lined up for you today. Lots of stuff to talk about in this episode. And the first thing, I just want to remind everybody out there, if you've been listening to the last few episodes, we do have a giveaway right now that's going on. We are giving away the Ubuntu Mate book, written by Larry Bushy from the Going Linux podcast. And I have one copy of the book that I'm giving away, and I'm going to announce the winner of that next week. All you have to do to be entered in the contest is to either go to mrptechreviews.com and hit the contact form and provide some feedback or information or comments from any of the last few shows, and or you just send an email to mrptechreviews@gmail.com. Whatever way you choose to, I'll enter you in the contest and read your email on the show. I always enjoy the feedback, and I'm going to get to some feedback that we have a little bit later on in the episode. For right now, however, since we're talking about the Ubuntu Mate book by Larry Bushy, I do have, as I mentioned, Larry is from the Going Linux podcast. I do have a Going Linux story from this week that I want to share with all of you. Earlier this week, I should say late last week, there was a post from a friend of mine who was looking for some install media for a proprietary operating system, let's say, and basically he upgraded to the latest version of this particular operating system, found out that it wasn't either compatible on his computer or he just didn't like it, tried to revert back to the original operating system, which no longer was there because his recovery drive had been erased. And so I jokingly posted there that if he didn't have any luck, to maybe think about trying Linux. And within a day or so, he got back to me. He was very interested in Linux. And so here's what I do when I'm introducing Linux to anyone new that maybe haven't used it before. I want to make sure that they get the experience that they're looking for first. So first off, I always ask the question, what type of software are you going to use? What type of software do you need to use every day? Do you need something that's Windows specific, or can you get away with using something a little differently? Do you need to use something like Photoshop, or can you use alternatives? And just kind of gauging where their needs are. And if they need Photoshop, then Linux probably isn't something that's going to work well for them, because there's not a Photoshoppy a version of Photoshop put out by Adobe for Linux. So I always explain the alternatives and how oftentimes they're very compatible. And if you're looking for something, you can usually find an alternative. But let's look at very specific software that you use. Do you use iTunes? Because iTunes isn't something that is available in Linux. I also look at who else is going to use their specific PC. Is any other users going to be using? What software do they need? Most importantly, is your hardware something that's going to be compatible with Linux? Linux has great compatibility, but it's not going to be perfect, especially with newer computers. The drivers haven't been written for the newer computers, and hardware support hasn't been added to the Linux kernel and stuff like that. So in this case, I asked him what type of computer he had, and it was a Lenovo desktop. So immediately my first thought was Lenovo usually has pretty good Linux support for their computers. I did, however, have a Lenovo laptop a while back that I bought specifically to use Linux on, and turns out it didn't work well on Lenovo laptop. That was the Lenovo Z580. But in this case, he had a Lenovo desktop. And I looked up the specs on his computer. It was an Intel i3, so Intel usually tends to work much better under Linux, and so I was compared to other things out there like AMD. So Intel usually is supported, so that was a good sign. And it was an older computer from 2012. Did not have UEFI on it, had an old, the traditional BIOS on it, so that was good as far as that goes. And so I started asking some more random, not so random questions about what type of printer do you have? It turns out he had a Brother printer. And in this case, Brother printers tend to be pretty well supported in Linux. And asking what particular model he had, looking up that model, it works under Linux. So he was actually very well off right from the start on how his hardware was supported under Linux. So seeing how last week's episode was geared towards Ubuntu Mate, my mind frame was I want to give him something that when it comes to Linux that he can enjoy using. And so I gave two choices. I gave him the long-term support of release of Ubuntu Mate, and I also wanted him to take a look at Linux Mint Mate edition as well. That's 18.2. That's also a long-term support release, and both supported for 5 years. And you really can't go wrong with either one of these. And so I gave him a video to watch comparing Ubuntu Mate to Linux Mint Mate, and ultimately it was his choice what he wanted to go to. He chose Linux Mint, and I think that's a great choice. Basically, I set him up with how to download Etcher and flash a flash drive, and then I had a few things to do around the house, and the next time I checked, he had Linux Mint installed already. So as far as new users go, many people say Linux Mint is a great way to go. In this case, I absolutely agree. He was able to install Linux Mint without any real issues. The one funny thing that happened right after he installed, the internet went out in his entire house. And I immediately said, Linux doesn't do that. Installing Linux couldn't make your internet go down. But he wasn't worried about that. Just a freak thing that happened all at once in his entire house. So we got Linux Mint Mate edition up and running for him. And gave him some software recommendations, and I'm looking forward to hearing back over the next few weeks how it goes. The other thing that I do when I offer any help with Linux is I don't just help people install and then just let them go on their own. I've told him that if he needs any help at all, to feel free to contact me, and just I'd be glad to troubleshoot some things with him, and hopefully, he sticks with it. It was kind of a situation where he had a computer and no recovery media, and didn't want to buy the recovery media because it was such an old computer. And why not try Linux? If it doesn't work, and he could always go back to what he had on it before. But in this case, I'm hoping it works out pretty well for him, and kind of a fun going Linux story. Wasn't expecting to switch someone over to Linux this week, but anytime I get to talk about Linux with somebody, I'm always gaming up for that. Speaking of doing some fun Linux stuff this week, over the summer, I was given a Raspberry Pi 2 Model B, and I didn't have a whole lot of time to look at it. It just stayed in the box, and I sort of, if you've been listening to the last few weeks, I've been talking back and forth about projects that I could do with a Raspberry Pi. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with it. So talking about Ubuntu Mate last week, the idea popped in my head. I knew they had a Raspberry Pi ARM install. And so I decided to take out the Pi in the middle of last week and just install Ubuntu Mate on it, just to start working on the Pi and see what it was all about. And I was really blown away on how easy it was to install Ubuntu Mate on the Raspberry Pi. And it was so easy, in fact, that after about 10 minutes, I had Ubuntu Mate installed, from download time to flashing the SD card that I was using, to just plugging it into the Pi and having it ready to go. It was really a short amount of time, and I was actually kind of thrilled about it, that it didn't take as much work as I thought it was going to need to be able to install. So after installing Ubuntu Mate, I just messed around with it for a few minutes. Really not sure exactly what to do, what my use was going to be for it. So I just got Ubuntu Mate started. I was actually pleasantly surprised on how snappy it was with the low specs on the Raspberry Pi 2. So then I didn't have much time after that, so I turned it off, and ideas started rolling around in my head. And in the middle of the night, I kind of had an idea that I wanted to really use the Pi for something that I could use every day. And OwnCloud popped into my head. I've talked a little bit about OwnCloud in the past. And after doing some research, basically my idea was to do an install of OwnCloud. And in order to do that, I needed to switch over. I didn't need to, but I figured I'd switch over to Raspbian. So I figured it wouldn't be just as easy as installing Ubuntu Mate on the Pi. So keep in mind, I've had no experience with the Raspberry Pi at all. So if anybody out there is listening and considering toying around with the Raspberry Pi, and it's very straightforward if you find some good directions on the internet. If you've installed Linux before, it's very, very similar. So after a little bit of research on OwnCloud, I had forgotten about the fork of OwnCloud, and I ended up deciding that I was going to install NextCloud. And so I did a little bit of reading on how to install NextCloud. And when I had some time, I basically flashed my flash drive or my SD card with Raspbian, installed Raspbian very quickly, configured the Pi to how I wanted it, and then installed NextCloud. And within, let's say, a half an hour, I had NextCloud up and running. Not quite optimized yet, but it was definitely working. And this was a learning process for me. The install was absolutely smooth and flawless, and I was actually blown away how easy it was to get NextCloud up and running. So one of the first things I did, I set up DNS so that I could, and port forwarding so that I could get to my NextCloud from outside of my home, and because that was really important that I wanted to do, I set up HTTPS. That was very easy and not that difficult to do. The biggest problem I had was basically I downloaded the iOS apps and connected, and then all of a sudden they stopped working. That was user error on my part. I enabled encryption. And when you enable encryption on NextCloud, you also have to install an app in your NextCloud desktop browser client. So once I installed the app, then I was able to connect to my apps again on iOS. And so basically the install of NextCloud was super easy and super simple. And if you're not sure what NextCloud is, I should have mentioned earlier, it's basically a home-built Dropbox alternative. And instead of storing your files somewhere else, you can store your files locally on the Raspberry Pi or an external hard drive connected to a Raspberry Pi, and you can have access to your files anywhere that you go. So right after I built the NextCloud install, I got an email from Ron, and I'm just going to read his email really quickly. He's giving me build ideas. So he says, "Hi, here's an idea as you're getting into Raspberry Pis and all. I've been wanting to look into building a sort of home central hub type of thing, and ideally to include date and time, weather, some way of adding and displaying appointments and noting from who, for me or the wife or the kids, etc. Then, to make it even crazier, have a way to change views to a calendar view to help with editing, maybe somehow hook into Google or Alexa with a browser, maybe dinner menus and planning." And he goes on and wants a lot of different features installed. And he said, maybe without being connected to a full-blown server, the Raspberry Pi or Orange Pi or something else that Dora has mentioned, with the whole thing not being a massive power hog, maybe you could even connect some sort of solar battery to it. Hopefully this helps get some ideas and the juices flowing. So Ron, it was perfect timing, because the things that he was saying, most of which you can actually do inside NextCloud. And so one of the things that I'm working on, once I went through the apps that were available for NextCloud, basically you can install and enable the calendar app. You can install weather app. You can install tasks app, where you can create a list of tasks. And I think if you're looking for some sort of a home central hub type of thing, NextCloud might be a place to start. I'm sure there are other great ideas. I'm not really sure about Google or Alexa or anything like that. But a lot of the features that he recommended in that email were things that I were looking into. And I explained to him that this was a perfect idea. If you're looking into a place to keep all of your stuff for home in one spot, I'd look into NextCloud and really consider it for using it for those kind of things. Now, I will say, I wasn't expecting much from the Raspberry Pi when it came to NextCloud. I was expecting it to be a little slow, and I was expecting it to, be underpowered, and I wasn't looking for something that was going to blow my mind. I was expecting it to sort of be laggy and slow and not quite work right, as some other projects that I've worked on in the past have kind of been. So far, NextCloud has just blown my mind on, number one, how easy it was to install. And number two, I've tried so many ways over the last few days to break NextCloud that I've lost track. I've downloaded the apps on iPhone and iOS and iPad. I've used the Android app to connect, all which work great. I've enabled two-factor authentication, which uses Google Authenticator. That works great. A quick tip here: if you try to enable two-factor authentication with NextCloud, what you need to do if you want to use the iOS apps or Android apps, you also have to set inside the desktop client, the browser client, I should say, you need to set an app password. It'll display a one-time password for you, and then type that into your iOS app or Android app, and that will let you connect to NextCloud with two-factor authentication enabled. So that's a quick tip. You got to actually go into your, I think it's either personal or admin. I think it's got to be the personal area, and then just enable an app password, and you're good to go. So once I got NextCloud up and running, I threw a bunch of files up there, and this is sort of kind of in beta testing for me. I wasn't expecting much, so I didn't put anything important up there just yet. And so what I decided to do was just kind of learn my way around. I started installing apps, and it's a little slow when loading files and navigating through the user interface with the Pi. That I'm sure is not the case on more powerful hardware. The Raspberry Pi, I believe, only has 1 gig of RAM, and it's a 900 megahertz processor. So I was not expecting it to be super fast. But for what I needed, I think it was working pretty darn good. Uploads and downloads went fairly quickly. The accessing from outside my home network worked flawlessly. And other than that, I came across NextCloud's recommendations for security and tips and things like that. And there was a couple of issues that it said, "Hey, we scanned your setup and we would encourage you to try a few of these things to make your performance a little better." And each one that I went through was another learning experience for me. One of them happened to be the OP cache settings. I could have set a little bit differently. And once I did that, that notification went away. And one thing I sort of learned about was the data caching, how that could improve your speed drastically by enabling APCu for data caching on the Pi. So that has been my only issue. And I followed the documentation, installed APCu, and I seem to be running into trouble with PHP and not enabling the APCu. I followed directions as best I could. Seems like some of the documentation on NextCloud is out of date. A lot of it refers back to Ubuntu 14.04. That's not a negative comment on NextCloud. I know there's a lot of different machines NextCloud works well on, and if you know what you're doing, you can sort of read through the fine print and get things up and running. For me, I'm not an admin by any means. I know a little bit, just enough to get myself into trouble. So I would break my connection to my DNS for NextCloud, and anytime I tried to enable APCu, and it just wasn't working. But if I took away the text that I inputted into my config.php file, then it would be back up and running again. So I sort of experimented with a lot of different settings, a lot of different config files, and really I just couldn't get it to work. But I will say I went to the NextCloud support forums, and they have been extremely helpful with this issue. It's not resolved yet, but we're working on it. I seem to have a couple of different versions of PHP installed. That's the last thing that I found out. So I'm hoping if I uninstall PHP and reinstall, I should be up and running today or tomorrow with that. That's the last thing that's really on my list of making NextCloud something that the whole family could use at the house. And but I'm not going to implement it yet until I get the data caching working. I had an issue with PHP 7.0, and NextCloud also saying that I was using PHP 5.6.22. I found other resources online with the fixes. I've tried the fixes, and still not working yet. But I think I'm on the right track as of now. Hopefully, I'll get this issue resolved soon, and then. By all other means, just one little hiccup that I ran into. It works great now, a little slow. I'm hoping with data caching, the speed will improve, and I won't have any more error or recommendations in my admin panel. And then I'm just going to continue to use NextCloud into the future and see how reliable it is. I've tried integrating sharing information from different apps into NextCloud. It works great. Any files I've scanned, I can import into NextCloud, no problem. And really, the iOS apps are really well done, beautiful. You can enable passwords and Touch ID so that you can keep your files secure on your phone. The Android client has the same thing. You can enable passwords. I've got a Kindle Fire that I just use for Android testing, basically, and works great out of the box. The Android client, I actually think is a little bit more. I just like the way the Android client works, or Android app works and looks and feels compared to the iOS app. The iOS app is actually pretty too, but the Android app, I enjoyed the way it looks a little bit better, a little bit more of what I'm used to using. As far as the setup and layout of the apps, I guess, is what I'm really talking about. So my biggest complaint about NextCloud, and by biggest complaint, it's really a small complaint. It's just the documentation seems to be a little outdated. And I know that's no one's fault in particular. There's a lot of cross back and forth that I've noticed between OwnCloud and NextCloud because they're so close to each other. But the support forums have been tremendously helpful, helping me out with just learning how to navigate through the config files like PHP, the APC .ini files. There's a few other things that they've just been really helpful, and just wanted to give them a big shout out and say thank you for the help. The issue still isn't resolved yet, but I think we're getting closer there. I even reached out to a couple of IT friends who sort of do this thing for a living, and we're narrowing down the issue, and I really feel that this is going to be fixed soon. So if you haven't tried NextCloud and you've been thinking about it for months or longer, I would really encourage you to give it a shot, especially if you have a Raspberry Pi, something low powered. I just turned the Pi on, and it has been a rock for over a week. Haven't really needed to reboot it other than when I'm trying to figure things out for this data caching thing. But it's been rock solid. I have had no connection issues, and I really think that the NextCloud is about as solid as you can get when it comes to just home use. I did speak with an IT professional who first looked at OwnCloud, and he didn't really care for the pricing options of OwnCloud, and then sort of just gave up on it. And he was not familiar with NextCloud, and he got real excited about trying NextCloud out. I believe he's got it up in a VM and is going to now implement it in the school district that he is working at as a resolution to an issue that they're having on their district. So that was kind of fun. I wasn't expecting my project to influence anybody other than maybe one or two people listening to the podcast. But he was very excited that Active Directory was something that could be implemented to NextCloud. And so I'm anxious to hear back on his progress for NextCloud in the professional world. If I hear an update, I will let all the listeners know on that. How well that actually integrates into something like Active Directory. So if you've used NextCloud, or if you have any thoughts on NextCloud, I'd like to hear from you. Please send me an email, mrptechreviews@gmail.com. Also, don't forget about the giveaway. Next week, I'm going to announce the winner of the giveaway. And Larry Bushy from Going Linux has also offered 3 more digital copies of his book. I sent him an email reviewing his book and told him he did a great job. So as far as giving away digital copies of the book, I can do that for you. If you email me, send me a comment on one of the past shows or ideas for future shows, and I'll put you in the list for the contest, and you might win either the actual physical copy of the book, which I have 1 copy of, or a digital copy, which I have 3 copies of. So with that said, that's going to do it for this week. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next time.